Well, hello. Um, I'm happy to spend some hours with you this afternoon. I hope it will be fun. Thank you for inviting me. I'm actually quite happy with this renewal of the architectural acoustics course that we can start building some bridges, knowing that I've been like you a student here in architecture a certain time ago. And at that moment, there was one course in room acoustics, but more like learning a mathematic formula by heart. And for me, that was at the time a kind of a kickoff into venturing into sound, because before studying architecture, it was more music, dance, and so on. So I was here and like, okay, we talk about space, but sound is kind of absent. For me, it was naturally always a sensation that was linked to sound. And so this kicked me into a venture coming off from the studies, starting to do research into the topic of sonic architecture, and in particular outdoor spaces, soundscape, and so on at the Institute of Landscape Architecture, where I also did my PhD, in which I tried to formulate something like a transversal discipline or undiscipline called landscape acoustics. And on the other hand, starting to experiment on how sound could become part of spatial thinking in outdoor spaces. On the one hand, in a more artistic way, performative exhibitions, but more and more also I'm trying to really push that into architectural projects from the very beginning. So I will show you one project. We can maybe in the discussion go further on, but I'm currently working on the 3 first construction sites on which I've worked since a long time, 2 urban developments and 1 bridge, where I managed to sneak into the planning team from the early beginning to try if we can make a difference. And the class that I'm teaching in spring is oriented also in that sense. On the one hand, have a more holistic understanding of outdoor acoustics beyond the notion of noise, which is predominant if you look at it from an architectural point of view and the regulatory framework we have to fulfill in architecture, but also to integrate a design-oriented and artistically thinking dimension, where sound becomes really also material of design, but it's also a way to engage with our environment, actually to listen to our environment. Life is always linked to sound in a way. We have been hearing a lot of praise about the quiet times during the COVID shutdowns, but also a lot of observations how a few birds are still around us. So the absence of other living voices could also be a way to tell us about the environment, the absence of presence about the more general conditions of our environment. So what we will do today, well, one afternoon is very short, and I think it should not just be me talking. So I will just give you a kind of introductory overview on some of the topics that are relevant into landscape acoustics. We will also go into some listening sessions, take the time to listen to some spatial recordings and arrangements. I will provide you some examples that can give you ideas of the variety of scales and of intervention where acoustic can play a role in outdoor spaces. And then we will come to your thoughts that you have submitted, and we will try to play with that and improvise a soundscape with that ourselves. I hope you have also brought the objects with you. So and we are going to make a recording of this kind of improvised arrangement. And that's it for today. Don't hesitate to interrupt you if I use any terms that you don't understand, if I go too fast or too slow. Yes, so the title picture I have chosen for this lecture, does anybody know this space? What do you hear when you look at the picture?
Water. Here.
What do we hear? Yes.
Yeah. Water.
Mm-hmm. What kind of water? How is the water sound?
Like flushing water, like the water is flushing, like waterfalls, and its pace is quite quick because it hits to the, I don't know, it hits to the ground or something.
Do you hear anything else?
And probably hits on a very like hard surface, like stone or something, so it's kind of very like high noise is coming from, and high frequency noise, I guess. And also the people around.
Other observations?
Maybe also the sound of the metal chairs moving when they are scratching the ground. Maybe they make some sound.
Okay, great. We'll come back to that. I have a recording from that. We'll not listen to it immediately. We come back to that. I have another picture. What do you hear?
Wind. I don't know why, just the wind.
Tourists. Cameras clicking.
Tourists, voices of tourists?
Yes.
And cameras?
If someone's shouting there will be an echo. If somebody is like shouting there, maybe there's an echo here because it's circle.
Okay.
Yes.
Footsteps.
Other ideas?
I imagine to hear like a constant like whoosh, because there's I think there's like the sea far away, so maybe the waves kind of just whole sound from the waves and far away.
It could be the sea. It's a sky in this in this case.
Okay.
But it's
There is a sea close, but it's
not
far
close enough.
Okay. It
enough.
seems like your eyes on the sea.
In this case, it's the clouds. You know what you're looking at?
Yet.
Yes, good. Has anybody anyone been there? You have been there. What did you hear?
in that picture. I would hear also footsteps. Well, in that particular moment, I don't know, but yes, birds, the air, wind, cameras, people chatting, people walking up, down marble.
So, what would you hear in this picture? Of the same place? Anyone? Everyone.
While you're walking, you can hear the leaves.
So different footsteps than before. You want to listen to that space? It's a recording taken from here, rather a bit down the stairs. Nobody of you mentioned the cicadas.
For me, it's default, like it's not, I don't know, I completely forgot their existence.
Yeah, but that's exactly the interesting point. Well, you hear also some voices from the tourists. Some kids playing around. What you're looking at here, did you already talk about sonograms, about the spectrum of sound, the composition on different frequencies? So a spectrogram is a kind of analysis representation method where you have time on the horizontal axis frequency from low to high on the vertical axis, and then the darkness of the colored parts is intensity. There are other ways of choosing that. You can also have rainbow colors, like for heat maps. But actually what you're looking at here is the analysis of the recording you heard, and you have this continuous sound of the cicadas. And what you say is exactly the interesting point, because when we would be in an urban situation, this sonogram is rather upside down. You have the low frequency continuous rumbling of the city, but you kind of forget about it if it's not too violent or it's not disturbing what you want to talk to each other. What's happening here is the voices of people. Actually, those kind of voices, they coexist. So the cicadas are always there, but they play in another frequency domain than the voices of people. So we talk about a relationship between two sounds, which is becoming, in a way, distant to each other, not because they're spatially so distant, but because they are different, so they leave space for each other to coexist. We also learn about something else. Well, what you see in both of these pictures, the whole hills, slopes are covered with pine trees, which is the primary habitat of these cicadas. So if you start to train yourself to listen to landscape, I think you will start to hear those habitats also. I didn't tell you that it was recorded in summer. When we were in Venice, we had 2 different days. One with the cicadas all over, and the other only seagulls because it was raining. Here you can see it's obviously not raining, but well, you couldn't really see because you're not close enough if people are wearing long sleeves or short sleeves. But actually this, because this whole pine trees are all over, if you're at that place, you feel like almost this high frequency make a kind of acoustic bubble or sonic bubble, which creates kind of almost interiority, not in terms of reverberation, but you're in a kind of continuum. It's quite a different reading from that place that what archaeological research and acoustics would focus on, which is mainly explaining how the construction of the theater was optimizing the distribution of the voice. I guess you have been talking a bit about this intelligibility of the voice with a direct path of the sound needing to be unobstrued until the receiver and the perfect mix of reflections from a floor and from a wall behind the speaker. But those researchers, they don't consider a larger environment. And if you go into landscape acoustics, you will still talk about this use-oriented role of the construction, but you will also take into account all the larger ecosystem and the life that comes with it and the sound that emits from it. That happens. But you also probably consider, once you have studied an environment and you build a theater therein, if the sound added by what you construct would not cover a part of the sonic life that is already there, and so in a way make it go away. Actually, this cicadas is a kind of noise too. Noise is just like another type of sound in a continuous spectrum, going from the sine wave that you see on top, which is not really existing as such in nature, to a more harmonious signal like an instrument or voice, where every frequency has this multiplicity in overtones, because every material would vibrate in a more complex mode, up to the really noisy spectra where you have all frequencies being present without any kind of ordered proportional relationship between them. So noise as such is not a bad sound. Noise is just an acoustic signal with a specific frequency range. Noise is used most predominantly in today's architectural and also environmental acoustic contexts is unwanted sound. So, but why? It comes from telecommunication. or at least the studies of telecommunication, in which every sound that was not part of the conversation in the signal was considered as noise. You probably know that from other technical system. Everything that is disturbing or parasitic, that is a noise. So this notion was adapted quite one-to-one when architectural acoustic was formalized, as to everything else that comes from outside is noise. So there we are with the landscape in a quite ungrateful position to just be noise because we are the other, we are outside, and we are not that in that controlled space that we wish to have at hand. So of course outside is a relative notion. Outside or outdoors, or the other can be the neighbor in the same building, outside of my room, outside of my street, outside of my of my neighborhood. But generally speaking, in terms of architectural acoustic, it's that indoor, outdoor, which is quite nastily considered in terms of the detail, also in attention that is given to acoustical phenomena. So I know you have had some basics. I don't have to talk a lot about sound propagation elements. Of course, propagation phenomena like different forms of reflection, specular or diffuse, but also absorption on porous surface, or diffraction around corner of sound. All this exists outside too. And if you are like on the scheme on the right in a city, we are sometimes in spaces almost like indoors. We just don't have a ceiling. But if we are in a small crossing path between two buildings in Niederdorf, we are not in very different dimensions from indoors in terms of the walls. We don't always have four walls. We often don't have a ceiling. But in terms of acoustics, indoorness and outdoorness is not so clearly, strictly defined by just a wall between inside and outside of a building. If we go to an extreme landscape situation, so in acoustics this is called free field, meaning that you have only one surface reflection, which is the ground. And of course sometimes it's lawn, the reflection is not very, very clear. If it's asphalt, it's more clear, so it's the same principle as for walls and ceilings. But the specificity is that you have the ground as only surface, which avoids that sound is bouncing multiple ways around you, coming back to your ears not only from the source and the first reflection, but also from many different sides. And so I like to think about these degrees, grays, shades between outdoorness and indoorness. So I've tried to just sketch it a bit, what I'm just saying. On the left you see a sketch about like indoorness situation, where you often have a controlled amount of sources. Like if this space, for example, was conceived, we know what we want to do within. There will probably maximum amount of 25 speakers with absorbing bodies. We want to talk and we want to listen to sound played back through a speaker system. There are other sounds, they weren't calculated really, but normally it's quite easy to overview. Outside it's like a mess and you just forget about control. So where are we then? That's the first element. So mostly you have like a messy arrangement of different sources that come together, and they are very important for the notion of space, because if you go to a free field situation, you don't have this reflection, you don't have the envelopment coming from the reflection. So what makes you feel in a space? So you have someone talking close to you, a bird being a bit farther, you hear a car passing back there, and suddenly behind you a tree starts rustling in the wind, and if you walk a bit, you imagine you approach a little river. You walk along it, you have always this kind of keynote sound that comes with you where other things happen. But a lot of our spatial impression is also shaped to proximity and distance of different sources. and this kind of grey clouds that I have been drawing, kind of rumbling from very distant sounds, which we don't recognize as a kind of very directed sound. It's just something in the air. And so it's also this balance between this kind of foreground sounds, which we hear as distinct sources, and this kind of more chaotic or even mixed up background that is an important part for how we feel comfortable in an auditory situation. If you imagine that you shout at your best friends, it's very uncanny to imagine in an absolute silent space, just shouting straight at your face. Maybe it's more comfortable to be next to a little river or something that gives like something there is already a sound, and it's not just like you take a light while you're in a black space and pull it at your eyes. And so in outer space, often when we talk about comfort, it's not only about the reverberation or the reflection from the walls and surfaces, it's about these relationships of different source qualities and their position in space and how they mix. We have then another element which comes into the messiness of outdoor acoustics, because this straight line that we are always drawing from like this, as I did it also, it's not necessarily always so straight, because sound travels differently with in dependence from the air humidity temperature. So if you imagine this little sketch is a bad drawing of myself of a sound wall, often this problem comes up that you have this perfect functioning sound wall in daytimes in this A curve, and at night it doesn't work anymore. Could you imagine why? In the night, the cold air is on the ground, and actually what's happening is that sound travels faster if the temperature of the air is higher. So it becomes a curve because it's the same sound, speeding up, speeding up, speeding up, and it jumps over the wall. Other similar refraction phenomenon happen with wind speed when you have different layers of wind speed, which is often the case in mountain in areas with complex topography. You have highly varying wind speeds. Same thing, the wind speed adds to the sound speed and refracts the trajectory from its straight path. So, and you observe also another thing, it changes with the daytime, with the seasons, with the weather, the way that sound behaves outdoors. So we are really far beyond control. So time is a very different, important aspect. Time and weather to take into account. Time, but not only in terms of, now we talk about how sound travels around, but we were just talking before about the importance of the composition of a sonic impression of an environment composed of different sources. And so also how we use space changes a lot. That's the same in indoor, but again, here we know it's closed in the night. Okay, we control what happens. In public spaces, in open spaces, you don't have that exact control, and things change a lot. They change with the seasons, with the weekdays, with the daytimes, and so on. So I want to take you to La Défense. It's in the north west of Paris, the biggest district, business district in Europe, located at the historical axis extending from Champs-Élysées. Its particularity is that it has a pedestrian axis. You see the prolongation to the Champs-Élysées axis at the horizon, which is wide and very mineral and glassy, so really modern architecture at a huge scale with no cars. it's very rare to have this situation. So I was quite attracted by this space because I think we can get its echo, its spatial voice in a particularly clear way because we don't have this street sound all the time. Of course, you have rumbling from a certain distance. So in this case study, I was doing with the acoustic and cognitive spaces team at IRCAM, with whom I'm working about the integration of spatialization tools in the design process of acoustic outdoor interventions. So we took this space as a case study, and we focused on this central area around the metro exit. And we did several seasons and daytimes and weekdays ambient recording with spatial microphones at strategic positions with regard to how the space was used in these different situations. I won't go to the detail, but you see there are quite a bit of recording positions that were repeatedly used. What I will now let you listen to is portraits. So from 3 different situations, 2 winter situations on a Monday morning, on a Friday afternoon, and 1 late spring situation on a Friday at noon. I recommend you to come to the middle to rather form like a more compact group.
But yeah, go into the center.
You can go outside again afterwards. What if you?
And there's no direction, it's everywhere, so
Yeah, you don't have to look at anything.
Yeah.
So this is an outdoor space, quite wide, with rather silent sources like voices. Of course, you don't hear sound bouncing all around, even if there are all reflective surfaces over it. But what you can hear very clearly that it's at this exactly same space, you can feel yourself in a very different environment if you just listen to it. It's different daytimes, and that's one thing I want to you take with you. This notion of time is very important when you work with sound, and even more if you work with outdoor acoustics. As opposed to what you just heard, the actual sound maps that are the primary tool in outdoor acoustic and urban acoustic planning seems like a kind of time collapse vis-a-vis of the lived reality. Those maps are of the averaged noise distributions for, if you are lucky, distinguishing between day and night time and maybe weekends. But when you hear what happens and how things fluctuating, this is not really picturing reality. So this kind of noise maps are very, very easily accessible. You can have them available. So for example, one of Zurich are quite nice. You have day and night times with a relative noise levels that tell you as architect which type of windows you would use or how you are, on which street you are allowed to orient living spaces towards the main street and so on. But they won't tell you what is actually happening there in terms of acoustic life. So these noise maps are a good basis for some of acoustic design, but they are a very reduced approach to considering acoustics as space and living environment. This is an example of a research that has been starting since the 60s, 70s, around the notion of soundscape. I will come back to that, considering more holistically the environment, first of all pushed by a more artistic composition interest in the natural change of the sonic environment. And this is a scheme showing how a same place is changing with the presence of different animals, but also different weather conditions over a year. And if you look at that, it's so clear that you have to have both of these tools and even much more. You can go very much into details here. We are at the level of seasons. We are not at the level of daytimes, as we have been considering before, but you can go down at the smallest scale of a sound to consider time. A single sound, is it continuous, like the cicada sounds, or is it momentary, like people talking here or there, or is it transitory, like a car passing by? Musique concrète, the movement in the first half of started in the first half of 20th century, thanks to the availability of portable field recorders, which allowed musicians to widen up the horizon of possible musical sounds and go and catch sounds outdoors and cut them into small pieces and rearrange them, really challenged them to think about how can we classify sounds if they aren't describable anymore with that classical notation system in very specific length and harmonic relationships. So they started to more think about this envelope of a sound. So the envelope, does it, for example, start quickly? So attack, it's the attack of a sound. How does it start? It's very different if you think about the piano or drum as opposed to a violin. And you can think the same way about environmental sounds, if they start suddenly, or for example, if you have a motor that starts slowly and gets slowly and slowly on its final level, or if it's something that is just shut on and off very brutally. And these are very important aspects also to distinguish sound, but also to understand why certain sounds would feel aggressive to you and others not. Contrasts are always very aggressive if you have almost silent situation and suddenly something falls down. You know that maybe if you're at home and you're reading a book and suddenly someone lets something fall in the kitchen, it's much more violent than if you walk on the street and there are already like 10 cars and then the 11th car is passing by as well. So what we have been considering here, that we just don't want to reduce outdoor acoustics or landscape sounds to closing our windows and make them stronger. It's not just about noise and as unwanted sound being outdoors. As Raymond Murray Schaeffer, which is a bit the initiator of the soundscape movement, this composition who was calling since the 70s about let's listen to our environment, he said noises are the sounds we have learned to ignore. And in a way, if you think about that, you can put it to a lot of things. You can put it to different cultures, to different living beings, and so on. If you don't engage with each other or with our environment, the environment becomes aggressive to us because we don't understand it. We just want it at a safe distance. So, in the more technical sense, what I'm saying here is also that classically in architectural acoustics there is a strong focus on propagation, so how sound bounces around in the space. But what we want to try actually to give an equal weight of consideration on the three acoustic P's, which are propagation. But before something can propagate, the sound has to be produced. So we also want to understand how sound is produced and what makes that sound is produced, and how come if we create a space, what are the elements that would add to the sounds that are there naturally or would provoke some sounds to install themselves? What on the level of production of sound makes us feel comfortable with the sound? But we also want to understand perception beyond the notion of decibel. What I'm saying here is not ignoring the health impact of too loud sound or too strong sound exposure. That's a serious topic. But it's not only about decibel. If a sound is like high-pitched or low-pitched and so on the health level that has an impact too, but also on the level how we engage with it. So this, I think it's a quite easy formula, like the three acoustic P's. Always think about, if you consider something, always think about all these three parts. A little excursus to landscape recording bring us to two central notions. We're talking about, on the one hand, sound sources and sonic environments being composed of multiple sources, but also having their specific acoustic property, room acoustic properties, and landscape acoustic properties, and an environment which is inhabited and which has a lot of listener or listening beings in it. Orchestras, of course, the first recordings were like one receiver in the front, and that was already a great achievement. But nowadays, orchestras are recorded always with two types of microphones, of course, multiplate, spatial microphones being hung somewhere there in the back of the room, the front, at different positions, but not too close to the instrument. And then, in most cases, every instrument has its own microphone additionally, meaning it's not just like a plug-and-play recording, meaning there is a whole remixing process behind that to find the correct balance to listen to these sounds coming together when you listen to them with headphones, if you listen to them on a stereo PA, or if you listen to them on a spatial situation. Actually, you can think landscape a bit like that. This source and environment thinking is quite helpful. We can also apply it to the what we have been talking about before, this background, more like mixed up background and the specific sources that you hear. You can analyze your listening experience a bit in that sense, like an orchestra in space. You have kind of general impression, like a color at a certain moment that evolves from it, and then you can decide to listen to a flute or piano. Of course, orchestra pieces are composed in a way. First of all, they are mostly played in spaces where you have no other like on background noise in a sense like random. on the other hand, they are composed sometimes to melt and sometimes to make one or another instrument to arise. There is for those sounds that would kind of come up, jump out perceptually from a mix of sound, it's quite amazing that we can even read something in all these kind of waves that come into our ears. So this distinctness of a sound from each other is called saliency. If you have an environment where you have a lot of low pitch noise, for example, and you play a high pitch noise, you can play it very low and it will still stick out. It's a bit like the visual gestalt theory. You can imagine that, thinking that how do you distinguish what is background and what is foreground? It's also a question of proportion of this overall like mix of sounds and the quality of an individual sound, and it's also an important notion that is used for judging a bit less poetically. For example, if you install a nightclub in a neighborhood with mixed uses, you will be judged on the noise that is produced by your activity and coming out to the street by comparative measurements of the level of the sound that comes from your activity and the overall ambient level that is already there. I don't know by heart exactly, it depends from the different zones, of course, but then you have, for example, the right to not be 3 dB, not more than 3 dB louder or not more than 1 dB louder than what is generally mixed up already there. But it's also, so this is what I'm just saying, is a very a notion that has also been meanwhile taken into account in a noise legislation. But it's also something that you can use for design. Imagine that you have a kind of rather annoying dumb environment. Maybe you can even the dumbness let it appear a bit in the background while you create a more interesting foreground or a more pleasant or a more peaceful or whatever. So what is very hard in that outdoor mess of different sources coming together to find a way of quantify and judge things. I think you have been talking about the frequency depending sensitivity of our hearing. We are more sensitive to a certain range of frequencies, then it goes down again, and independently we have these measurement curves which are weighted to that sensitivity, because you have probably been already looking at decibel A weighted or C weighted, which is like the judgment of sounds and their decibel value with regard to in which frequency domains there are. So for example, with a low sound that is in the frequency domain where we are less sensitive, you have a right to have more intensity, more energy present than in the central sensitivity range between 500 and 2000 hertz. So just if you get to deal with outdoor measurements in decibel, you always check if there is an A next to it or not, to understand if it's taking into account this unequal sensitivity of our ears. And then there is a domain which is important to study to go more complex in the more complex domain of perception, which is psychoacoustics more largely, which is also a field where the function of spatial hearing is studied, but they also try to find out what makes a sound pleasant or not. And so there are 4 main parameters, which is loudness, that's the most common thing. Then we have roughness, which describes a kind of grating sensation, which results from rapid amplitude modulations in a sound, so rapid that you don't hear like an up and down of level, but it still creates something like a grating. So it changes the textural quality of the sound. Sharpness is a sensation, describes a sensation that relates more to the spectral composition of the sound, not to its temporal behavior. The more high frequency energy is in a sound, the more sharp it is considered. And there is also tonalness. If a high portion of sound's energy is in a harmonic domain, so you perceive a pitch like a pitch that you could play with an instrument, which is considered, funnily, in environmental acoustics as disturbing because it attracts your attention. So a sound that attracts your attention is disturbing in an abstract way, but it's just disturbing if it's a sound that you don't want to hear. If it's a sound that you want to hear, you are more than pleased that your attention is drawn to that and not to another, whatever random humming of a ventilator or so. I will get you an example of roughness, sharpness, and tonalness. So we listen to a pure tone with increasing modulation depth. So the modulation is getting more and more important. So you feel like it's starting, almost feel like a sanding paper on your ears. That's what we're talking about, roughness. And then sharpness, I start with white noise, meaning just all frequencies are equally present. And then I filter it to give more energy to the higher frequencies. Okay, so that's not part of the program today. And then we have the tonalness. So we have here a small electric fan. So you hear like a pitch in there. The problem with those measures, that these are laboratory measures, and until today none of those would consider what happens if different sounds come together. So this relativity of how we perceive a sound is until today not quantifiable. The only thing has been quantifiable is with like single test sounds like those to check how the appreciation of listeners would change. So with tonality, with increasing or decreasing loudness and roughness and sharpness. So you see, for example, tonality, isolated sound like this, people would say, well, I like the more tonal sound. But for example, in transportation acoustics for trams and so on, the most important thing is to avoid tonalness, because you don't want this attractive, and so on. So it's, again, very relative and contextual. That's also what Murray Schaeffer underlined when he says, of course, there is noise in acoustic terms as messy combination of frequencies. Then there's any loud sounds, as often as it's going today, just over a certain decibel in terms of what is quantifiable. Disturbance in the signaling system, but there is also sacred noise, which can be like a thunder or whatever, and which brings us to another dimension, the one of the emotional relationship to sounds, which are relying not only on the acoustic qualities of a sound, but on the semantic level. So we were talking about Pali Park. If you think about the whooshing of a waterfall, I will show you a recording, but I think you won't like it really, because it's not a nice sound as such. You need to feel the cooling effect of water. You need to see the water to appreciate that sound. So the notion of soundscape, as it was proposed in the 70s, describes the sonic environment, and with a quite open view on either the actual environment or musical abstraction of it or so on. So it's a sonic environment in a more human-centric perspective, as with an analogical notion to landscape, soundscape. So the kind of perceptual construct that we make of this ensemble, but with an important attention also to social-cultural aspect. For example, the study of how industrial neighborhoods that are about to transform would change in their soundscape, in their quality of sounds, and what does it mean for the identity of that neighborhood if some sounds would disappear, or the importance of certain sound marks in different cultures like cowbells, church bells, and so on, or the importance of presence of wave sound for people that have been growing up at the water shore, and so on. So it would take into account the socio-cultural dimension. You probably know Kevin Lynch, The Image of the City. Some of you have been studying it, I guess. He had a student, Michael Southworth, who tried to apply that reading also to the sonic environment of the city. And he found out, he made tests with people who had to close their eyes and walk around along his path, others that had to close their ears, and others that could use both senses. And then he evaluated how they appreciated different parts of the city. And what came out that, interestingly, those that would only hear would be closer in their appreciation to those who used both senses, those that would only see, meaning overall that the hearing has huge impact in the overall evaluation of how we feel in an environment or not. I can give you, as a follow-up for the lecture, I can send you the download link of this article. It's quite interesting because it goes a lot into study also what it means if you lose one sense or another. The context of the soundscape movement is important also to take into consideration. I was talking about musique concrète, the playing around with sound taken from outside, cut into musical pieces and rearranged, which led to a more specific studies of the temporal morphology and the spectral morphology of environmental sounds, but also an environmental sensibilization, which was finding its first expression also with making appeal to the notions of the sonic environment, with Rachel Carson's Silent Spring telling the story about birds disappearing because of the use of pesticides, but it's not just the bird eating the pesticides. She's describing all the circle of soil to worm to plants and so on. But she uses as an entrance to the complexity of the story the observation that of a neighborhood where people would only be able to act in terms of environmental protection once the birds would not sing in spring anymore, because that gives that emotional impact that, wow, our living environment is really suffering. Of course, there also another level of artistic environment at that moment is, on the one hand, experimental music, which is a bit different from musique concrète. It's not about tape music. It's more about opening music up to listening. And also land art. How can we make small punctual intervention and change the whole perception of an environment? In this context, listening becomes really a central artistic practice. For example, Pauline Olivieros, who was developing a whole school called Deep Listening, with exercises like take a walk at night, walk so silently that the bottoms of your feet become ears. I recommend you this exercise. It's really nice to do. And also the interrogation, what means hearing? So if you just hear because we have ears and we cannot close them, or if we listen to something, or if you start to understand and interpret or make sense of what we hear, is a very different way of engaging through hearing with the environment. This implies also not only thinking about human importance of how we feel well in our environment, but also understand how our natural environment is organized in a sonic dimension. More attention is given also to what sound can give us as information about the environment. What is the presence of different types of sounds, like sounds coming more from earth movements or from animals or from machines? How do they interact with each other? How do they coexist or not in an environment? But also how different beings behave and develop their own sonic intelligence in the environment, like birds using in terms of in which landscape they chase. If it's an open landscape or scattered with small leaves, they would use very different signals with regard to the surface that would potentially reflect their calls or interfere with the surface that is actually their the object of their chasing. So all this taken together makes a quite complex field of studies, which is here quite nicely arranged in this study by Pietrzykowski and Farina and their colleagues. They centered around soundscape ecology. I won't see that very much as a centric scheme, but more to appreciate this different approach, like studying at different spatial and temporal scales on a more territorial approach of interaction between unorganic, organic, and so aspects of the environment on the level of really animal behavior oriented perspective. Today this is also expanded to plants, but on the other hand also on the deeper understanding of human hearing and the whole cognitive part of it, and acoustic ecology, which in this case is like the more contemporary notion of soundscape studies, meaning that maybe to what is most closely also to the origin of that notion to try to classify ambient sounds to understand how the shape of our environment is perceived in the sonic domain. And of course the different elements of our physical environment that would contribute to the conditions of a soundscape. So, I have let you wait for this stream. We are now ready to listen to it. I was starting very close, and I will go out of the space more and more. What's actually happening here is a space in New York on 5th Avenue, built in an open building lot. Usually was occupied, before it was occupied by a nightclub which was destroyed. It's a really small park, almost like an indoor situation, so it's a lot of reverberation in there. People really love that space because they come there and they talk, and those that sit next by, they don't hear them. And they also consider it as soothing, but if you hear, we were going out on 5th Avenue, and it seems, in this context, very soothing to listen to 5th Avenue. Actually, what's happening there is that if you stay for a while, the water is so loud that it shuts down the sensitivity of your ears. Our ears are adapting their sensitivity to the environment. And if you walk out to the street, your ear takes a while until they take up the sensitivity again. It's like you have a light in your eyes. It takes a little bit of time to adapt again. But the space is wonderful. You just cannot record the comfort of it. It's even horrible to listen to it like that, and you're really happy to be back on 5th Avenue. I will jump a bit to the we talk now about like shaping like a source, like water, which of course if you talk about a small river is not at all the same like a waterfall, or if you think about the lake, often we don't hear the lake, but we hear probably all the activities that are provoked by the lake, like people swimming, people coming there with their picnic and so on, taking a walk, or earlier whole transportations which have been arranged around lakes and rivers because this was a flat area, at least in Switzerland. If we come back to all this has often not been considered in landscape history writing, so lots of places, historical places, are studied with that idea of a visual construct of landscape, at least in Western culture. But you can go back to places, and if you listen to a lot of these places, you would feel maybe those that have made that places have had a sensibility for sound. It's just not the way history was written. One of the most evident phenomena, which is best documented thanks to Rock's art and the foundation of archaeoacoustics, is the echo. We are still fascinated today if we find a rock situation where we can create an echo. No, even if we can explain exactly that we have to have a certain amount of milliseconds minimum distance between the sound that we hear direct and comes back. So it needs at least 17 meters distance of that rock to the sound that creates it, if it's next by to hear an echo. Otherwise it's just becoming reverberation. But still, we are fascinated. It's something like if the rock would talk to us. And archaeological hypotheses also are projecting that on rock paintings, for which for a long time nobody had an explanation why they were placed at very difficultly accessible places. So with this idea that, well, there were particularly reflective rocks and giving a sense of animated something. And artificial echoes were also constructed in the fancy 17th, 18th century gardens. Tuileries had an echo. It was destroyed later to build a visual axis out to the landscape. But there is a lot of history writing about this place being very a playful meeting place for all kind of people, which is very different from, like, if you think about noise walls, separating things, various acoustic phenomena, bringing together things. And so I will, for this first part, I will stop with taking you again to La Défense, this time with acoustic recordings of the place, so measurements of the acoustics, allowing to make a model of it and placing virtually new sounds in there. And so I will let you listen to two pieces. I think I won't be able to let you listen to them for the whole period. I would say maybe let's stay for 5 minutes for the first one, and then I will just let them play and you go to a break and come back when you want. So the first one is like transforming the real situation with implementing artificial sources and transforming it to a kind of image where it becomes Place de la Défense, becomes Plage de la Défense. Donc, you know this slogan from some years ago. But imagining if that in this acoustics a totally other habitat would come and take over. And the second one is very abstract. It really literally takes the measured trajectories of sound bouncing around in space, slowing them down, and sonifying these trajectories like a spatial painting. So feel free to move, to come in and out. And I guess I will, let's say we will start again in 15 minutes officially. In that 15 minutes you can listen and walk out and in as you feel. And those who listen, in the middle it's better.